Good evening and welcome to the New York Historical. My name is Ken Wine and I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Content Officer here, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the beautiful Robert Smith Auditorium. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank a number of trustees who've joined us tonight and our Chairs Council members for all of their great work and support. Tonight's program, The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism, and the Looting of America, will last an hour. Then we'll have a Q&A session. There are written cards. There are note cards going around. You might have gotten one when you walked in. If you don't have one, raise your hand and you can get one. If you're joining via live stream, welcome. And you're welcome to submit questions on the Zoom Q&A function. After the program, we will have a book signing just outside the main auditorium. Please exit and go to the gift shop, as they say, and grab a book and join the signing. Now to our speakers. It is our great pleasure to welcome Mehrsa Baradaran to the New York Historical. Professor Baradaran is a professor of law at the UC Irvine School of Law. She's testified before the U.S. Congress and Senate as an expert in financial policy, served on 2 presidential transition teams overseeing the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Ms. Baradaran is also the author of multiple books, including The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap, and The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism, and the Looting of America, the subject of tonight's program. We are also honored to welcome Khalil Gibran Muhammad back to our stage. Dr. Muhammad, please. Khalil is the professor of African American Studies and Public Affairs and director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project at Princeton University, which he joined this year. He has contributed writing to numerous outlets, including the New York Times, and is the award-winning author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. I had the honor of being his colleague when he led New York Public Library's Schomburg Center, where he did many very big and important things. We are also honored that he is a scholar trustee of the New York Historical. And an important program note, per the wonderful success of this program, he's agreed to return early and often to our stage next year and anchor a series we're going to call A Nation in Conversation on additional topics. So many thanks, Khalil. Before we begin, turn off your phones or anything that can buzz. And now, please join me in welcoming our guests.
Such a great crowd tonight, given the spring weather, let's call it that. We could use some renewal, shall we say.
Yes.
Mehrsa, thank you for joining me tonight at the New York Historical Society. We fan on each other's work. We've actually not spent a lot of time in person together. So I was very excited that you said yes to the invitation to join us this evening.
I'm so honored to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming. All right, so we're going to start with the F-bomb just to get things going, because I think that it hangs over this moment in this conversation. But just to put things in perspective, you wrote this book before the recent election results.
Yes.
And so you tell this really interesting story about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you do a little kind of self-identification with her. So how is it that the fascism that many of us are worried about, for you, helps to open this book with a story about Marjorie Taylor Greene?
It was an uncomfortable sentence to write when I said Marjorie Taylor Greene and I have the same gut feeling about the distrust that we have toward what's happening. And the problem is that we diverge in what we think is why, right? Where are we pointing and who are we pointing at to blame? But there is a sense of distrust that is widespread. I think if you asked any American across the political spectrum, is it, one, do you trust whatever the sources of power are? And again, we have to be very basic about the low common denominator. Do you trust the government / media / whatever? 2, do you think that our society is fair? And I think we would, and then take out all the reasons, I think we would all generally agree it's not fair. Like if you were a baby born tomorrow, would it matter to you where you were born? Would you think you had the same opportunities everywhere? And I think people would say no, right? And in that way, that distrust, that sense of unfairness breeds fascism. And I try to explain why, in that you do have an untrustworthy system. It's not that this distrust is out of nowhere. Yes, there's conspiratorial thinking. Yes, there's all of this made up stuff, but there is a feeling that you have to honor, and that feeling is valid. There is much to be distrustful about, and I would call it, political corruption. I would call it money in politics. I would call it certain things that are eroding our democracy and taking away our vote. And I think Marjorie Taylor Greene would have different explanations that would come from I would say, not critical stance, but it's, you look at
that's to put it mildly. Yeah. All right. So let me pause you there because, you're not a seer, meaning that your ability to describe things in this book that have now happened and have happened again since you first wrote this book, I think are just very important to the larger arguments, which of course we will get into. So you open the book with a story about the Paradise wildfires, which created scenes of a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape with raging wildfires. 100 people died. And you talk about the state utility, PG&E, that is responsible. Now, of course, you could not have known that while this book was either in print or soon to be on bookshelves, that another wildfire would consume your state. Right. So since we talked about Marjorie Taylor Greene, she shows up precisely because of her response to this wildfire. But you're more interested in something far less sinister, which is the very nature of the way businesses operate and the legal structures that allow them to do so. So tell us a little bit about this utility and these recurring wildfires. Yeah,
so the Paradise Fire, if you remember, 90 people were killed, and it was truly devastating. And the cause of it was PG&E chose not to upgrade its faulty equipment. And despite warnings, they had already been charged for manslaughter for a previous fire where they also knew that their equipment was faulty, refused to do it. There were elderly people in these communities that were, it was just devastating. I won't go through the details, but it was truly gruesome. And instead of upkeeping their equipment, they went through bankruptcy, and then their shareholders, got the payoff of that, right? You can use the court system in this country to evade all sorts of liabilities. PG&E did it, the Sacklers did it, many other companies. Big Pharma and Big Pharma, lots of people, when they get liabilities or tort liabilities or even criminal, you can kind of restructure and, your share price goes up. And Marjorie Taylor Greene got her, she became who she is now based on a Facebook post in which she says, something smells fishy about what happened here. And then she points to Newsom and Dianne Feinstein and the Rothschilds and the space laser idea, right? This is the Jewish space laser thing. So she goes into the most anti-Semitic, deep just parts of our culture and pulls out this theory that I'm afraid I took a whole book to explain, and hers was a paragraph, and she's the highest. This is our problem. We cannot win with that. And there was a salience to it. She just said it's those guys' fault, and everyone was like, "Yep, that sounds familiar." And she's the highest raising political. She's the head of. She was just grilling NPR and PBS last week, and it's because she's giving an explanation that is so anti-Semitic and so false, but she's pinpointing the emotion that a lot of people felt about that. Something smelled fishy. It wasn't fair what happened. Yeah, it's called corruption, right? At the root of what her critique is corruption, and that's precisely what brings you two together. Yes. Okay, so we've introduced fascism and corruption. We've talked about Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yes. We've not talked about neoliberalism. Yes. And we're not going to talk about it just yet. So, at the end of this book, you tell a very powerful personal story. And in many ways, you actually tell the story of writing this book and the difficulty you had as you opened up both to your own personal story and also a vision of the broader world that we live in. Yeah. So help us understand how your personal, sometimes you refer to as your me search moment, as research for herself, informs
why you think that fascism is a symptom of neoliberalism.
Okay, thank you for that, and let me try to shorten this. I realized this is my third sort of big book. I've written a lot of articles, but this is the third book. And midway through, and I wasn't finishing it, you know, I spent 6 years or so just obsessed with it. And when you get obsessed with something, you realize something more is going on. And there's this one chapter in there, chapter 2, that ended up being the whole book, you know, and it was just, and
At
I
one
realized,
point it was 100,000 words,
It was 100,000 words, this one chapter, and that's a stupid amount of pages. But, you know, I was like in everything, and just trying to, you know, and I realized I had to like just step back from the computer and be like, I am writing a memoir, and I cannot be writing a memoir because I kept circling around, you know, what happened in Iran in the 1970s, which is when I was born, in 1978, pre-revolutionary Iran, and I think I was trying to write the story to explain why what happened to me. And you never want to be doing that, obviously, in research, and it's not in there, that's not the book, you know, it is an academic book, but what happened in Iran in 1978 is we were the first, Iran was the first neoliberal project. In 1953 or so, we had a democratically elected leader, Mossadegh, who was overthrown by the CIA and the British, and instead of that, we get a monarch, a Shah, and a lot of neoliberalism. You know, the oil companies come in, and there's a lot of corruption. You know, the Shah is enriching himself. They're definitely westernizing. It is free. You know, there's feminism. There's good things, but there's a just growing discontent by the population. And what happens in 1978, as you all probably recall or at least have read about, is the fascists take over from the right. And it's not, you know, they had destroyed the left, you know, where they thought that the threat would come, but it was the radical right. And this was not Islamic fundamentalism wasn't an Iranian thing until it was, right? We were, you know, a largely secular country. Iran post-1979 is not what Iran in the 1960s. I mean, there were women in like miniskirts. In the 1960s, they reduced the age of marriage in 1978 from 18 to 9. In 1978, decriminalizing rape, essentially. So just to say that we went backwards. So my childhood, I grew up under fascism. That is the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, hijabs, guns in the street. So many men died in that war. There was an 8-year war with Iraq. So, and then just martyrs. My mom went to prison for 4 years for speaking up against just nothing, for nothing. Most Iranians have been in prison by this point. And so why did that happen is because they came in and they say, we will fix it. We will bring back law and order. We will bring back, right, you can trust us. So I just think that for me, the night that Trump got elected, I mean, the first time I couldn't sleep because I was like, oh, it's here. It's the seeds of it are coming, and we're still far from it, you know. And then I read Hannah Arendt again and again and again, and you can see it from 1919. Hitler comes to power. Hitler comes on the political stage in 1919, and there is corruption from 1919 until 1933 when he finally takes over. There's a lot going on in Germany. It was, you know, the Treaty of Versailles was not fair to Germany, made them pay a lot of war reparations and, you know, drove their economy into the ground. Anyway, there's a lot of discontent, there's some corruption, and then Hitler comes in and blames, again, the Jews. Yeah. And that's who Marjorie Taylor Greene is blaming. That's who, you know, it's not even original, but it is. But you have to look at what preceded it instead of thinking, oh, these are bad people. Like the people in Iran that took up the guns and went against their own people were no more inherently violent than were the Germans in 1929. That is the lesson of history, is that it can happen anywhere. You grow discontent enough, you allow the state to get corroded and corruption and rule of law to break down, and someone will come in and fix it.
Yeah. Okay. So partly by way of illustrating how these stories affect all of us. Mm-hmm. All of us have a relationship to the three stories you've just told. Mm-hmm. But what we don't appreciate is that the causation mm-hmm. That you explain in the book, mm-hmm. what this coup is all about, mm-hmm. Actually surprises us. So if you're a banker here and you're in finance and you thought you were on the hook tonight, You can relax in your seat. You are a downstream effect, according to Mehrsa.
I think you can all relax, actually. No enemies.
Well, but the lawyers, I don't know.
Okay,
you know.
yes, fair. I'm a law professor, so I am implicated.
Okay, so let's break this down.
Yeah.
So you describe a crisis that emerges in the world that is a 500-year-old problem. And it is that problem for which what your country went through in the 1970s is just the end of a long series of disruptions. So explain to us how colonialism makes possible the need for an adjustment, which you call neoliberalism, and we'll explain in this story.
Okay. I teach a course on this, so to be quick is going to take me, okay.
Okay, so let me help you out.
Yes,
So,
yeah, thank you.
so there's,
Yes.
for 500 years,
Yes.
people all over the world
Yes.
are subjected to the extractive needs of colonizers who essentially take from their countries to build wealth.
Yeah.
Today we call these the global north, the global south.
Yes.
Okay. All right, got you
Okay.
started.
So,
there you go.
So you have the Spanish go to, you land here, they're trying to negotiate. These are very sophisticated cultures that that are in, the Inca, Maya, Aztec, all of these people. They're negotiating with Cortez and Pizarro and these guys. And they murder them in cold blood often, like just stab them in the back and go back home and they say, we did this. And what they do is they take the gold, right? So King Ferdinand sends Cortez and Pizarro and says, get gold, humanely if possible, but get gold. It's just about plunder, okay? It's all about plunder. They come back and they say they were savages. The people who murdered in cold blood, the very people who were peacefully negotiating with them, call them savages. So into the world is born this projection. And it has to be justified, right? So you say they were savages, they were below us, they were not human, and therefore we had to kill them. So then racism, and then you take the land and you make it plantations, and then you need workers, and so you go to Africa and you do war on Africa and take slaves for hundreds of years, and that needs a justification. So you say they're less than human, or God decreed it, right? God gave us rights. This is John Locke, right? God gave certain white men rights and not those people. So these justifications are secondary. So race comes after the need for land and plunder, the sort of need for profits and capitalism. Not capitalism writ large, but just extraction. And then those ideologies that justify it keep having to evolve because they're not true, right? So the religious justification goes away, and then you get like a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-Darwinian justification. There's, actually Khalil's work is amazing on this. You have the phrenology charts that show black people are inherently criminal. Irish, by the way, are also inherently criminal. That just basically justify the current world order. Why are the Irish a lower race? Well, they were a colony, so they were poor. You had to justify why were the Irish people poorer than the British people. And you can't say, well, because the British were plundering them. But it has to be inherent to something racial. So those ideologies go away the second the Nazis take that out in Europe. So Hannah Arendt talks about the origins of totalitarianism in her book. She says the thing that made the Nazis possible is colonialization. In other words, colonialism. You do not have hundreds of years where you're justifying plunder and genocide based on white supremacy and not become a culture sick with colonization, okay? She calls it the boomerang effect. Amisa Serra calls it, it's just, you have the Hitler within. Hitler is a byproduct of that system of colonization. And then it goes away. Once the allies take the Nazis, the threat is gone, the world sort of has an interregnum. Okay, so the alibi, let's say, of empire is gone. You can no longer use white supremacy, but the motive is not, which is that you still need the oil, from the Middle East, you still need the copper from Chile, you still need all of the stuff that was feeding
The
Europe.
gold from South Africa.
The gold and the diamonds from South Africa and the cobalt, all of that. You still need that stuff, and now it's all corporate anyway. So the new ideology of empire is neoliberalism. That's the thesis of the book.
Okay, so let's stop there. Okay.
Yes, okay.
Because I want to connect back. No, great, wonderful. Applause. That was pretty good, right? All right. Okay. So, 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 So just briefly, just to illustrate, to connect back to your own personal family story, is precisely the British claim, or at least a deal that they make for Iranian oil that breaks down.
Yes.
Yeah,
so the Seven Sisters oil companies, they had these deals with Iranian oil, and it was
Standard Oil,
Standard
Chevron.
Oil, Chevron. They said, basically like tankers for $1. And they'd gotten them from the Qajar kings forever ago, paid off the kings, and just stole the oil. And
so no market dynamic.
No market dynamic. And when they
take.
tried, every leader that tried to renegotiate, let's say, they'd bomb Parliament, or they would bomb them into like signing the contract again. It's sort of like The Godfather. It's like your brains or your signature on this contract.
Or a university today.
Or what?
Or a university today.
Exactly.
A metaphorical bombing.
Yes, exactly. So there wasn't under coercion. So when Mossadegh comes to power, this is the 1953 guy, he's elected, a Democratic leader, and he says, not that we're nationalizing the oil, that's what they call it. He says, you can buy it from us on a market. We're going to sell you the oil for a market price. And that's when the coup happens. And it was messy. They didn't do a good job. They left their fingerprints all over it. It was the first, but not the last of that era of coups, right? And many other leaders, Allende and Chile, I could go down a list of people who tried to do the same with their resources. And this was what was happening between the 50s and the 60s after empire falls. So after World War II, you've got a decade and a half or 2 decades where every country that was owned by 5 European nations, you're talking about the entire world, but for like 4 or 5 nations that were never colonized, everyone becomes independent. And everyone either has a civil war or some general strife, and they come to the UN and they say, we want one nation, one vote. This is the G77 movement, the non-aligned movement. It's about resources and sovereignty and things like that. That's what's happening in the 60s. We look at the civil rights movement, but it was a global South sort of anti-colonial movement that was the big threat during the 1960s. And so in Iran, they got the Shah in the 50s, and then they just gave him torture prisons and all billions of dollars of weapons to keep the people from rioting, from demanding their democracy. And that is the pressure that then leads to the right coming in.
Okay, all right. So now we actually can talk about neoliberalism, because it's a solution to this unfolding crisis of decolonization. 5 or 6 European powers control the resources of the world.
Yeah.
They use violence to suppress dissent. That violence is no longer legitimate in the face of the Holocaust. Now there's a crisis of authority and legitimacy. And as such, some people go to work to try to figure this out. So you talk about 2 important Swedish economists, enter the economists, Gunnar Myrdal and Friedrich Hayek, who are both awarded the Nobel Prize in 1974.
Yes.
Their road, though, to that moment is precisely the road to trying to solve for this crisis. And they have 2 very different solutions.
Yes. First of all, well, let me start. Myrdal is a Keynesian, sort of before Keynes, and his idea is, look, we can have a worldwide economy. We can all be wealthy. Essentially, there isn't really scarcity by then. There is a little bit, but now there isn't. But in the 1970s, it's getting to where we actually could feed the world. And so his idea is, you've got colonization for all of this time. You have to do some remedial work and then let everyone come together as sort of equal nations. Hayek's idea is anything that any government does that gets in the way of the market is tyranny, right? Is the road to serfdom. And so, but the fascinating thing is, this is 1974. This is not necessarily the Cold War. And the Nobel Prize in Economics is not a real Nobel Prize. I don't know if you all knew this or not, but it is the Alfred Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics awarded by the Bank of Sweden, okay? And it has everything to do with, yes, the neoliberals themselves created a Nobel Prize to make economics a science like unto physics. This is one primary neoliberal myth is that economics is scientific, that there is a thing called the market that is natural, neutral, mechanistic enough that you can just study it, and that it should not be bothered, okay? Bothered by anything that looks like, quote unquote, DEI or government intervention. And what we know, what those of us who study money and banking and economics know, is that the market is just a series of rules and laws. There is no such thing as money but for the state creating it. There's no such thing as capital but for some court saying that is an asset, right? That from the beginning, markets are a creation of law.
It's all made up?
It's all made up. It's all made up. What is capital? What's an asset, right? And it has a moment in time. Before the 1600s, you couldn't buy land. It was handed down by the Lord. After the 1600s, you have this thing called a deed, and that's the start of land as capital. And then after that, you add things to it. Slaves become capital, right? Sharers become capital. You know, and you see it evolving. Crypto is now capital where it wasn't before. And all of this is just abstract ideas built on legal cases, and a court says to you, well, you can pay your taxes in this, and now it's capital. You need to put this on a balance sheet, and now it becomes wealth. That's a market, right? So why would Hayek and the neoliberals say that? Why was it important to say that the market is natural, neutral, whatever? In the same way that Christopher Columbus and those guys come back and say, well, God said to kill those guys because they're savages and they need Christianity. In the same way that the pseudo-Darwinian, eugenics type said, well, black people are poor and they're slaves because they're not as evolved. It's science. It's out there. It's some principle that may not be challenged. And so this is the ideology in the 1960s that comes to the fore to say, leave the world as is. The global South is poor. Black neighborhoods are poor because of the market. Supply and demand, it's just simple economics.
All right, so I want to dig in here because
Okay.
now we're in the sweet spot.
Okay.
Okay, so you've got a bunch of countries, most of the world, who are poor by dint of being plundered and robbed for hundreds of years. And now they say, listen, we are still mineral rich.
Yes.
We have incredible human talent.
Mm-hmm.
We expect to have the same human rights as the rest of the world.
Yes.
The UN has declared it.
Mm-hmm.
The world is beating its chest that war has ended. You know, we're never going to do this again.
Mm-hmm.
We have a such thing as international courts to protect human rights. And so we want to be treated like independent nations, just like any other country that's had a head start on us since this whole fiasco has gone down for 100 years.
Yes.
Okay. But in exchange for actual democracy around the world and for countries to have self-determination and sovereignty over their own resources, a bunch of economists and lawyers get together and figure out a new strategy to say, this isn't going to happen.
Yes.
And that is the origin. So rather than starting with the definition, I wanted to give you the history that explains the moment that then gives us this thing that doesn't exist. So let's talk about Milton Friedman, the University of Chicago, and everything that goes on there.
Let me say also that the economists and the lawyers are the ideological cover. They're like the John Locke. There's also the pirates. I mean, there's like the Francis Drake. There's like the Kissingers and the Dulles brothers. I mean, there are the people who are using violence. So that's always there. The violence is there, right? The military-industrial complex is not dismantled. There's Johnson's war in Vietnam. Here, that's, they're there, but then we need an ideological cover. We can't start bombing Cambodians in secret, hundreds of thousands of them, by saying this is white supremacy, this is our right, so how do we do it? And so this is the interregnum where things get messy, and this was why I'm in that era. But yes, the lawyers and the economists come together, and they kind of weave this ideology, and it's like macroeconomics. It really starts actually, truly, I mean, this is Alan Greenspan is Nixon's advisor on race. Pat Buchanan brings, can I say that again? Alan Greenspan gets brought in for a solution on race for Nixon because there's the protest movement that has, followed the Civil Rights Acts. And what's happened is you've created, equal rights on paper, but you still have hundreds of years of the ghetto and segregation and massive inequality, massive gaps in all sorts of things. I mean, one out of five children is growing up in deep poverty in the ghetto compared to 1 out of 12 or something. It's just a lot of inequalities. And Alan Greenspan comes in, and then there's this sort of crisis that Nixon, as a candidate, is facing. And Nixon needs to win the South, so he needs to get the George Wallace voters, but he can't say segregation forever and still win. And so he brings in Greenspan, who says capitalism, right? So instead of doing anything about the ghetto, so where there's not going to be any integration, there's going to be no fix at all, and we're going to say that the problem with the ghetto is a problem of capitalism. In other words, you're like that because you're an inferior worker.
Can I tell a quick story on
Yes.
this point, just to illustrate? So when I got to the Harvard Kennedy School, where Kissinger now has a named chair, and for many years walked its corridors, I walked by the office of an econ colleague, happened to be an African-American guy, and we never hit it off, but we were cordial. I was interested in him. And I remember him asking me, what are you working on? So I said something about racism. I mean, what else is there? And, and he said, well, you know that, that basically inequality is just a differentiator of skills.
Oh God, I think I know. It's a soul.
I mean, so that the disparities and the inequalities are not a function of oppression or history or ongoing structural racism, but in fact, the maldistribution of talent and the inability to achieve certain skills by dint of one's own personal failures and cultural dispositions.
Yes, and this is why DEI, to do anything, right? So this is Greenspan to Nixon, to do anything to fix the ghetto. I mean, I'm calling it the ghetto because that's what it was. It was enforced by segregation and by violence. Okay? To do anything about that is anti-capitalist, right? So you call it socialist, and then you say just leave it, and the only answer is capitalism. And that's what they do, meaning do nothing, leave it. Same idea globally. So what Nixon does, at the behest of the economist, is they end Bretton Woods also. So at this, I don't want to get too financial, but for those of you who remember the pre-Bretton Woods, a nation could keep its capital inside the nation, right? So you could grow your industry.
You should tell them what Bretton Woods was.
Okay. Bretton Woods was the post-war sort of alliance. Keynes puts it together. And the idea is to build economies after the war. And pre-Bretton Woods, let me just use an example of the auto manufacturers in America. We built GM and Ford without competition. You didn't have other nations bringing in cars. You could really, I guess you can call it tariffs or whatever, but it wasn't tariffs. It was just blocks. You could not take capital from one country and bring it into another. You had a ring fence. Now it didn't apply to the colonies. The colonies were all foreign capital, but they were owned, right? So the question is then what happens when you don't own the colony? Let's say South Africa. How do you keep control of the mines? So what Nixon does is remove the Bretton Woods capital walls around the country. So now capital can free flow around the world after 1971, and that just allows a supercharging of empire, but through money. So it doesn't have to be the British Empire out there. It could just be a corporate entity.
It could just be British Petroleum.
It could just be BP. And they're just investing, and they're buying up properties, and they're buying up, the same, essentially like apartheid mines now become De Beers. It was always De Beers, but it's now just the market that's justifying it. It's a capital, it's just profits. That's it.
So I want to read, just to clarify this, because we took this surprising turn into the ghettos of the United States and whatever it had to do with what's going on with neoliberalism. But for you, it is not just instrumental, it's foundational to the story. So you say here that Greenspan writes a memo, you've mentioned it, I'm just going to read your own words. Greenspan argued that it would cost too much to raise blacks to the level of affluence of middle-class America. And so Nixon should shut down anti-capitalist talk of reparations or remediation. Using government policy to address racial inequality would be Greenspan warned a dangerous harbinger of socialism, which would make, quote, major inroads into this country if the left got what it wanted. Sound familiar? Greenspan's critiques of the liberal hypothesis that it would lead to horrendously expensive poverty programs that were irrelevant to the foundational problem. So it's not just solving for the sovereignty problem or the self-determination problem. It's also an explicit admission, like, we don't actually want to do the work to pay for the redistribution that would be required to achieve a democratic and fair country.
Yes. The tragedy is also that per Myrdal and per Keynes, you didn't actually have to redistribute. You didn't have to take money. They call it redistribution. We're so stuck in the neoliberal mindset that it's almost hard to think about it any other way. But look at the New Deal. The New Deal created wealth out of nothing. You create wealth. The government can do that. We don't actually have a scarcity of wealth. It's not like you have to go take money from here to bring up the bottom here. They didn't fix the ghetto because they needed racism to win political power. Racism has always been more of a political weapon. It's not inside hatred, right? It is a political weapon to divide up allies, to loot for somebody's gain, and it's usually a minority of somebody's, right? Some corporate person. But that scarcity doesn't exist. It certainly doesn't exist now. It didn't exist in the 60s. Per Keynesianism, per Myrdal, you can actually just create as much wealth as you're willing to tolerate. I mean, think about how much money we've spent on wars over the last 40 years. And where did that money come from? We just decided, or somebody decided, that they were going to write a check, and then the Treasury tells the Fed, and the Fed just pushes a little button, and the money goes. It's not like you have to go somewhere and get it. You don't even need taxes, right? Taxes do balance the economy, but we could solve these problems tomorrow, all of it. But we didn't. And it really is tragic when you go back into these documents from the 60s, especially the non-aligned movement, all of these nations really coming to the UN very earnestly, being like, okay, we're finally free.
They're still coming to the UN.
They're still coming. We're finally free. Let us have sovereignty. Let us have, right? And the US is first vetoing stuff at the UN, but then it just becomes outside of government. And here's what I will say, because I brought up the boomerang thing. You do not colonize without self-colonization. You bring it back. You do not disrupt other people's democracies and nations. You do not do coups in third world countries without doing it ourselves, to ourselves. So what's happening in America, the corruption, the literal coup that we had, is stuff that's been happening in the third world. People would say, look, this feels like a third world, it's turning into a banana republic. That's kind of global karma. You don't justify what we've done in South America and what we've done in the Middle East, what we've done in Southeast Asia, which is democratically elected governments being undermined by money, powers, by sovereign debt, right? You don't justify that without it coming back. I think this is what we're seeing, is this global boomerang once again.
All right. So I'm gonna finish at least this main question to close out this definition. So a working definition, we might all agree at this point, is that neoliberalism is the moment when the market becomes the most powerful instrument for domination, and that government is perceived no longer as a tool for adjusting societal interest for the common good, but in fact becomes the enemy of the market. Fair?
Yes.
Okay.
But actually a friend.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right. You wrote the book.
Yes.
So there's one last wrinkle, and it's connected to things we've already been talking about, but I think it's helpful for an audience like this because I mentioned Milton Friedman. You write about Gary Becker, an economist lesser known, but he's a mentee of Milton Friedman. And there's Thomas Sowell, who is also a mentee, who is very well read in New York City and often is cited in these hushed tones like it's really Thomas Sowell that has it all figured out, and all these liberal Marxists who are describing inequality are the liars. I mean, if you get caught in a YouTube rabbit hole like I do sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, I went and got these degrees, and all the time it was just Thomas Sowell. They had it all figured out. Okay.
Yes. Yeah,
But
Yes.
I want you to explain
Yes.
how the market logic denies the rationality of racism. Okay, that's one charge. And then secondarily, that for white Americans who have often been taught and or believe that their successes on average, from median income to median wealth, to longer lives, to better health outcomes, you name it, even the poor ones, there are no poor white communities in America today that are even close to as poor as the poorest black communities in America, despite all the ways in which we like to compare a black billionaire to white people. That is not the right comparison. That is not an apples to apples comparison. Okay, that for white people in this country, it turns out that their success was government sponsored.
Yes.
As compared to the black people in America and poor people around the world who actually live under what you would argue is much less risk, much greater risk and much less support from governments to mitigate those risks. Unpack that for us a little bit, because I think that's the one lesson here that I think people would not capture in understanding neoliberalism. If the market is all powerful, then people themselves are not sharing fairly in the distribution of the market's risks and rewards.
Yes. Okay. So neoliberalism says, per Gary Becker, per Milton Friedman, that racism is inefficient, and therefore, if you allow the market to work, that no one would sacrifice profits to be racist, right? So it would just, the market will take out racism. You still hear this, right? This is Thomas Sowell 101. And in fact, the argument turned in the Reagan administration to it's the government that is the most racist, right? It was welfare that killed black families. It was the more government intervention, that's actually racism. But the original neoliberal thinking was that racism is inefficient. We are all like homo economicus, rational people, and that's kind of a neoliberal assumption, and a rational person wouldn't do racism. And therefore, if there are racial disparities, it has to do with the people who are poor. Poverty becomes an individual problem, not just for black people, but for everybody. If you're poor and the market's fair and all-knowing and neutral and natural, then you failed at capitalism. You're just bad at being a hardworking, genius like Elon Musk. And I want to say, Elon is the creation. I mean, when you do neoliberalism, Elon is what you get, right? He's the winner of this whole thing, right? Because it produces that kind of efficient mindset. And by the way, he's a racist and misogynist. It's all there. But the way that neoliberalism covers it all up is that it just really, it's just a new ideology that's just like the others, that pins the blame out there to some abstract entity that shall not be messed with. It's like a god. It makes the market into a god, and if the market decrees it, it is. And so racism can be justified, and in fact, it's the market working, right? And that's why DEI is government intervention. Right? The old myths are buried in the new myths. It's not like you have a new myth like neoliberalism and you overcome the racial inferiority myth. We don't talk about it now. We don't say, racial hierarchy per Darwin, but it's there. It's an assumption on which neoliberalism builds. And so when you start asking questions, right? Well, why is it that black people are poor? Then the IQ people come out, right? And the IQ people, all these people, by the way, the Charles Murrays, the Thomas Sowell, it's not just natural, these are the guys. They're funded by these right-wing neoliberal foundations, right? There is money at this pivot point in the 1960s that funds these academics to say these things. The marketplace of ideas really sort of like chooses these guys. I don't know if that fully answers
No, that
the
gets
question.
it. Yeah. So take it on the world stage, and everyone in the global south are undeserving poor people who are, creatures of their own fate. The market is rewarding those who are the talented ones and punishing the rest. And
well, there's something about scientific evolution and progress that the northern nations just figured out how to do technology better, and they were more progress. Again, off stage is the fact that they were colonizing these people in chains.
On the same bookshelf for some people as Thomas Sowell sits next to it, books that are apologizing for colonialism. That,
Yes.
Look at all the wonderful things we did in the world.
We brought trains to India. Like, at least say thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get a couple questions in here. So the first question is, how does a neoliberal understanding of history actually take away our own agency to change human society? I love this question because you have a great answer.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
How does a neoliberal understanding of history actually take away our own agency to change human society? They also add, what is the alternative to Hobbes and Rousseau?
Yeah, so ideologies are really, they're different from propaganda, they're different from politics. It's like the water you swim in. It's so totalitarianism. Neoliberalism presumes not just to explain the present, but it explains history, the future. It is an all-encompassing ideology. So when in the neoliberal mindset, history is just one series of like economic decisions after another. Why did the British win? Because they had faster trains and they figured out this thing. It's all efficiency, right? So you look at history and neoliberalism makes sense of, again, it's an apology for colonialism also, just with a new vision. Just like the eugenics era presumed also to explain history, right? So all of these ideologies do that, and therefore, yeah, you don't have to, you're basically powerless to make decisions. I mean, you've heard people say this, it's just economics, right? It's all just market, supply, and demand. There's no way out.
Yeah, but you actually think there's a way out.
I think there's a way out.
Yeah.
I think it's crumbling. This is, it's imploding on itself. I think the financial crisis was neoliberalism's implosion.
This is the 2008 crisis.
2008
Since someone
crisis.
just asked about it.
The 2008 financial crisis was when all of the neoliberal myths just fell apart, and we're still in that aftermath. It takes a couple of decades. I mean, look at, World War II ends in 1945. It's not until the 60s where we get the new era. I think we're in an interregnum. All that's happening right now, where neoliberalism is, it's not ended. It's still the pervasive ideology, but a new one is coming, and unless we're careful, it's going to look like the old one with a new, justification for why the world is what it is. But of course, there's a way out, and the way out looks like what the people in the 60s were trying to say. Listen, at this point, we're either one globe or we're committing suicide. Like, we've got either nuclear weapons and massive just wars that mean nothing, do nothing. Or we figure out how to get trains everywhere. And you saw during COVID, I mean, COVID, we saw the supply chain. We saw the virus. We're all one ecosystem. We're one globe. And the last people to get it is us. Right? We're also linked up. I mean, there's a lot of optimism. I start the book in deep despair. And I end it in a lot of optimism.
After Trump's election, you felt better.
I felt, yes, I do. I think that these are the last gasps of this thing. It is the last gasp. It's scary and it's chaotic and a lot is changing, but I think we make it. And I think we do so by different means than we got in. I think, this is just opinion, but I think the era of like the nation state and government in the way we thought of it is over, and they're showing it. They're looting from the inside, and the way we get out, I think, is just new ways of thinking about how to make bonds among humans outside of, get out from the ideologies, get out from these abstract ideas. Just look at capital, for example. Elon has more money than anyone can ever spend, and it's growing faster than you can even imagine. I mean, compounding interest is no joke. And that's what neoliberalism did. Neoliberalism unleashed capital from interest rates. We deregulated interest rates in 1978. This is my work. This is the work that brought me here, is understanding capital and how fast it grows and how destructive it has become. It's just sitting in these massive endowment funds and these massive private equity firms, billions and billions and trillions of dollars, and it has to grow. Capital must grow at 6 to 20% a year. Some of these hedge funds are saying 22%. Where is that money coming from? It has another side, and it's debt. So it's sovereign debt, credit cards. Their assets are our liabilities, and that only goes in one direction.
Right.
Massive poverty on the one hand, and obscene wealth. I mean, wealth that your great-grandchildren couldn't spend because it's going to grow faster than they know how to do. It's just numbers. It's just digibits in the cloud, and it's crushing us underneath it.
Yeah.
So we got to get out of that.
I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, if you break it down at the simplest level, the measure of billionaires for most of our lives, it's the people of the Gen X generation, has been a measure of a country's success. Mm-hmm. The more billionaires a country has, the more successful that country is perceived and ranked in the world, which of course means that they're getting their money from somewhere in the world that someone is paying a price for, which brings us to Ursula Le Guin, for anybody who knows that story. Yeah. All right, so what successful examples of other economic models can we point to as alternatives to neoliberalism throughout history? A question that was asked a couple different ways.
I mean, I think we go back to, this is where I get like, not an economic model. I think we go back to a model of community. We go back to a model of nature. I mean, water, look at how water flows, and you have everything you need to know about economics. I mean, water doesn't have borders. It is free flowing. You dam it and you get, you know, evaporation and then no downstream water, but it just needs to flow. Currency is the same. Money needs to flow around. I go back to the Silk Road, pre-capitalism, pre-colonialism, and because I'm not anti-market. I love markets. I'm from the center of the markets in the world, right? Iran was the world center of markets. You bring your goods and you trade it, and you didn't need gold coins until, you know, the Greeks. But you have ledgers, you have currency that actually is just about a way of communicating with each other, like how much saffron is worth like a goat. That's what currency is for. Not let me hoard it indefinitely for future generations. These bad ideas that then create, right, capitalism forever. And we're, you know, that's related. So I think an economy that just is a free market that requires, first of all, freedom. First, before freedom, you need justice. We need absolute justice. And you cannot have justice without remedying past injustice. And we can't move forward until we have justice, because there is karma. Yeah,
so you have this wonderful line in the book where you say, I mean, part of what has kept, okay, quickly. You start talking about justice here. And we didn't talk as much about the law, so the lawyers didn't get as much of ringing. But you basically say that the law is no longer connected to justice.
Yes.
That the law is unaccountable. Yeah. And that through the power of big money and corporate lobbying, lawyers are able to twist a rationale into anything like, for example, punishing a company for having ESG commitments to sustainability and protecting the environment against further degradation. And now it's against the law to impose such standards. So this is where you say that the law is the instrument of neoliberalism through its complexity, through its dynamism, through its relationship to power, but that it doesn't have to be that way. Like if it's all made up, then you could center justice, and we could actually ask reasonable questions, like, is this good for the world?
Yes.
Should we require companies to be accountable for the things that they do to Earth, which we know will produce mass death and destruction?
Yes. And is it fair? Because justice is about fairness. Justice, and this is a thesis that is very, you know, non-academic, but I believe that justice is a feeling, and we all feel it. That's fair, that's not fair. And I think the law is over here. The law is code, it's language, and you can do anything with the law. You can get PG&E through a bankruptcy and wipe its hands clean through law. The law is just a playground for the rich at this point. The tax loopholes, look at, I mean, my former law firm.
You could even extort a law firm that, that was just doing its job and get $100 million out of it.
Yeah, it's just code. But justice is over here. And the bigger the gap between what the law does and says and justice, that's hypocrisy, that's corruption. Those are the seeds of fascism. That's what happened in Iran. That's what happened in Germany. This is what's happening right now. Here's the law, and here's the felt sense of injustice that we all feel. And that's the space that we got to watch.
Okay, all right, so that feels like an ending note, but I'm going to get, this is a twofer and the last question. So the first part of this twofer is, does union power break the cycle of neoliberalism? Do rising unionization rates give you hope? And related, how do we convince the Democratic Party to loudly disavow neoliberalism?
Okay, I was on, 2 Biden transition teams, and I was the nominee for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. You can look it up, I'm not making this up. And my deep sense of despair came from that experience, seeing I feel like at that moment, I may get in trouble for this, but we lost Treasury to BlackRock. We lost the banks. We did not get, I wasn't the nominee, we didn't get any nominee. We did not get a banking nominee, not one that was Senate confirmed. I feel like it's a little too late for that kind of reform. This neoliberalism is not a Republican thing. It is Republican, it is Democrat. Both candidates raised $1 billion. I voted for Kamala, of course I did. I called people, of course, it was the better choice. However, it wasn't a choice. And I talk in there about Obama. Obama comes into office with all of these promises, and I think Obama's hands are tied before he even is inaugurated by the financial crisis, by the banks already in there. He brings in Larry Summers, and Larry Summers was not going to let his reputation go down like that. So I think neoliberalism is just so pervasive that this is where the despair comes from. The hope comes from, well, if it's just money, and the reason I didn't get the nomination was because someone paid off Kristen Sinema, not just for me, but Sinema and Manchin, like $400,000 each, some cheap. It was not expensive. So if it's just money, why would we could use money. We can just do it through money. We can use our endowment funds. We can use, if anyone out here is a billionaire or knows of a couple, I have some ideas. And it wouldn't, and it's just about routing the money in this little thing. You know what my idea would be? There are certain industries that are clogging up the mechanisms of our lawmaking. It's weapons, it's guns, it's oil and gas, and it's tobacco is an ancient one, but maybe big pharma in a way, that get into law. And these are dying industries. Let me just say tobacco and not, let me leave tobacco out, but weapons and oil and gas. If it were a free market, those would not exist as massive entities that they are. Weapons just lives off of government largesse, and so does oil and gas. So I would, if I were a private equity firm, if I had $1 billion, I would just buy up those companies. I wouldn't work the law route. I would just let Raytheon and Halliburton build trains. I keep going back to trains, but we could use some more trains.
Certainly faster ones.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kat Schwartz. I am Director of Public Programs here at the New York Historical. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And for our billionaires in the audience and otherwise, I do want to remind you that we have Mehrsa Baradaran's book, The Quiet Coup, for sale in our museum store on the 77th Street side of the building. And she will also be signing books in our Smith Gallery just outside the auditorium doors. Now please join me in giving a final round of applause to our speakers.